Sebastian Salazar, how are you?
Great, Jason. Great to be with you, man. I think I've said this to you on other platforms or off camera at some point, but huge admirer of your work. Both as somebody who does the work, I'm impressed by what you do, and also just as a consumer, I
Oh,
listen pretty much every day. So
well, it's obviously reciprocated, and we're going to talk about what you're doing these days and the full plate, the responsibility I think you've
hmm
taken on in soccer in this part of the world, and I do want to get to that, but this is called One Shot on Frame, and the whole point of this is to talk about a photo, at least to start. And now you sent me three. You cheated. You sent me three photos, even though I asked for one, which is fine. We'll get to the other two. But you said, okay, if I have to pick, I'll go back to the beginning. So right now, Sebastian Salazar, what are we looking at here?
So this is me and my mom at the 1994 World Cup. Mexico played two of their three group phase games at RFK.
Mm-hmm.
We had bought tickets for the entire package at RFK as a family well in advance of the World Cup and well in advance of the draw. Like we had no idea that Mexico was going to be coming through. My dad had actually kind of ID'd it as a big family event in like 91 or 92. So he said, we're not
Wow.
doing family vacations. Like we're putting that money towards the RFK ticket package. And we kind of lucked out with Mexico. So that was really for me kind of the launch pad. I was a huge soccer fan leading into that World Cup, but I loved like a lot of sports. I was a general sports nut, and soccer was part of that. And then after this World Cup is where I pretty much just focus in on soccer. Is that
Mm-hmm.
one sport that I'm really like obsessed with?
Well, I imagine a World Cup experience would do that. So you're for I mean, you said RFK. For
Mm-hmm.
people who don't know, you are a DC native. What I love about this picture, so let me, if I can just comment. I mean, your mom looks great. Your mom looks amazing. Your hat. There's a lot of going on with this hat. The curve on this bill, Sebi. It's, I know it's 1994, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you could have done a little bit more work. It's fine. We got some glasses. Okay, we need to be able to
Yep.
see. I get it.
Yep.
The collar on this Mexico shirt. That's something. That's
So
something
this is
else.
this is clearly, and anybody who has family in another part of the world will know this. Like sometimes you ask for, hey, like send me a jersey or send me this or send me that, and you might get the authentic or you might get kind of the knockoff. So I think this is from my Tio Mini. He sent a knockoff and maybe even just a hand me down knockoff. So clearly it's a little too big right there. And the hat is an odd one. I think if I can pick it out, it's like a Buffalo Bandits hat. The Buffalo Bandits are an
Okay.
indoor lacrosse team. So my old man is from Western New York. My mom is from Mexico. So that's a combination there. And man, those were just some amazing, amazing games. They played Norway in the first game. They lost. That was like just incredible heartbreak. And then they played Italy in the last game, the group phase, and they got a draw, like a come from behind draw to get through. And that being there on that day was just incredible. Like, just a memory and a core memory, I think, is the term that I would apply to it. Something really special.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, you took your football, your soccer cues from your mom. I mean, you mentioned your dad from Western New
Yep.
York. I mean, your mom from Mexico City. And she's flying the flag. She's wearing the colors. How early did that start? The indoctrination, Sebi.
I think I probably started watching soccer with mom, around 5 or 6, but I was also watching other sports with dad. And, dad is from Western New York, so a very rural kind of non-soccer upbringing, if you could imagine. I think he was first exposed to soccer in college. He said there was like an English foreign exchange student that was at his tiny school in Western New York, and they were, they did it in gym class or something. So he pretty quickly caught on, but my mom is the one that kind of first showed me the sport and first showed me like being a fan of the sport. So
Right.
we would watch Club America, which was on quite frequently. I mean, back in the mid 90s, there was really not a lot of soccer on in the US outside of the Mexican league on Univision. And so, that I would watch Club America, and I would watch a lot of the qualifiers for Mexico. I remember in the lead up to the 94 World Cup
Mm-hmm.
was prime time viewing. So that indoctrination kind of starts there. But I think I'm also very much from my dad's side a sports obsessive. Like he was a Bills fan. He went to the AFL championship games back in the day. He
Wow.
he was very much like that. So I think the specific of soccer definitely comes from mom, but that kind of like sports nerd definitely I think is a characteristic from my father.
That 94, that summer of 94, eventful for your dad. There were some other things happening right around that time with a
Yes,
former Bills player. I don't want, we don't want to
exactly.
open up that can of
Exactly.
worms.
Now we were huge Bills fans in the 90s, though. Imagine like
Yeah.
people know Mexico following Mexico's heartbreak. Imagine being a Buffalo Bills fan in the 90s
Yeah.
as a 7 through 10 year old. I mean, it
Oh
was brutal.
man. Yeah, I remember those teams. All right, so but I mean, so your mom is the soccer person in the
Mhm.
household. I mean, your dad, you said, came to it. I'm always intrigued by those dynamics within a relationship, especially when there's kids involved, because you know what? Okay, another question I have here about sort of your exposure, and as you said, maybe Mexican football was the only thing that was really available. Was it Spanish? How did language happen in your house?
Yeah. So my mom, I think, made a very intentional effort early on with me to speak Spanish, like almost exclusively Spanish, her and I. And then even my dad, who obviously, grew up speaking English, didn't speak any Spanish until he met my mom. He's got a pretty good gift for language. So he picked it up, and it was a lot of Spanish in the house before I kind of had English take over in school. Because once you go to school in a
Hmm.
specific language, that's really kind of overwhelming. And at that point, my English, pretty clearly overtook my Spanish, but I always had the base. And then just the reality of if you wanted to watch soccer, you were primarily watching it in Spanish. On top of that, my mom's favorite team, which was Club America and the Mexican national team, which is what I was being introduced to, was readily available on TV in the
Yeah.
States in Spanish. So to me, when I start really consuming the sport, it's almost entirely in Spanish. It's not until later on that you start getting like broadcasts in English. I would say when I was late middle school, early high
Hmm.
school. Other than that, like it was like VHS tapes and best of compilations that
Yeah.
that you would have to borrow from friends that would be like the English language soccer on in the States outside of major events, like the World
S-
Cup.
So did you do you think now, even now, that watching the game and consuming it in Spanish informed how you think about it
Oh yeah.
now?
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. I think one well, listen, I mean I wouldn't particularly pick at any other styles, but I think the if you listen to a Spanish language announcer, it's going to be a very excitable and usually dramatic call, right? It usually feels like there's a lot on the line. And so to me, that translates not only I think to the game, but to the coverage of the sport outside the game. Like it can be very dramatic, it can be very sensationalist, it can be excitable. And I think that's clear. And, if you look at kind of what I'm doing now on ESPN and some of my work in the past, I definitely kind of go down that route. And I think if you have ever listened to me call a game in English, it probably has a lot of tendencies of what you would say are, the stereotypes of a Spanish language announcer. I mean, I even do the goal call, so the kind of loud classic goal call. I'll break that out from time to time. So it's definitely an influence because that's the first language that I heard soccer, and not just on TV, but in my house. Like that's how we were talking about the game.
Mm. In terms of your identity growing up, you're growing up in the U.S. Your dad is from New York. Your mom's Mexican. I mean, you're split in that way. I mean, obviously the soccer was a major part of your life, but as you said, a sports obsessed kid. How did you think about your connections? I don't know if this is a weird question to ask, but sort of how did you think about your connections to Mexican football from this side of the world?
Well, I think it's so much of what you're introduced to first, right? And I think for me, the US didn't have a qualifying campaign leading into that World Cup, so I wasn't really seeing them. My mom was the one that was turning on the TV to see Mexico. And so I think from like a soccer standpoint, I always identified as a Mexico fan. I mean, that was really basic to my soccer identity. When I would go to practice, I would not wear U.S. men's national team kits. I was wearing El Tri kits. That's what I was being sent from Mexico. Not just El Tri kits, like even the things that still fit me to this day, the Club America's 90s, the classic Adidas kits. Like that's what soccer was to me. So I think I identified very much as Mexican in a soccer,
Hmm.
fan perspective. I think the other thing is, and surely anybody who's watched the show or maybe even just interacted me knows that, like, I don't mind being on the other side. I don't mind being a contrarian, and it very much, is evident in the teams that I choose to support. Like, I didn't mind being a Mexico fan in the United States. Went to the Bills fandom point. When I was a Bills fan, they played the Washington team in the Super Bowl, and I didn't mind being
Yeah.
a Bills fan, in DC growing up. Like, I like, playing the heel a little bit, in that
Okay.
regard. I liked rooting for the other team. I didn't want to. I used to root for University of Virginia basketball while all my buddies were Maryland fans. It's kind of that I liked rooting for the opposite side, and so I
I
think
see.
that was very natural to me, maybe from a personality standpoint, and then just being exposed to it, I always identified, very much as a fan of Mexico. As far as like an identity, I think,
Yeah.
that's way more singular. There's people who will say, "Oh, I identify as Mexican American." I think I don't know that I identify as Mexican American. I think I'm very much like American and Mexican in some way.
Okay.
Because a Mexican American, a lot of people who are Mexican American grow up in a community of other or around other Mexican Americans. That wasn't really, my experience here in the States. So I think I've had a different experience to most Mexican Americans, if you will.
Okay. So you're conscious of that. Did you feel like you have to acknowledge that, particularly when you're interacting with the communities? Obviously, you have a partner on Football Americas who grew up in a Mexican American community, like you're talking about.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think if you talk to anybody who's maybe not born, raised, lived their whole life in Mexico, has spent any time in the States, they probably had an interaction with maybe a family member, a relative in Mexico, who, if not directly, indirectly, kind of questioned how Mexican they were.
Uh-huh.
And then, that'll happen within I'm sure, the Mexican American community as well. I look like my dad's dad and not my mom's dad. So I think, people will look at me and see a gringo face and hear my, how I speak right now. And they'll say, oh, this guy has a certain look. But I think that's, if you grew up, and you grew up in the DC area, like, or ended up in the DC area. This is a place that's very, diverse, and obviously that's like a broad term, but there's just people from all over the world. So, like, being Mexican or Mexican American, you never really felt different because kind of everybody was different,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, at least in kind of my neighborhood and in my experience.
No, I think that's probably true. I mean, even when you have particular pockets, you might be living a street over from people who are very different. I think that if you are in that environment, when you grow up with different influences, it makes you feel less different. Was going to ask you about playing soccer. I mean, you say you wear El Tri kits, you wear Club America kits to soccer when you were a
Oh
kid.
yeah.
That made you stand out, but probably not in the same way it would make someone wearing those kits stand out in Nebraska, for example.
Totally. You know what's funny though is my soccer experience was, as I look back on it, like, very informative, and you know I grew up because my mom was interested in the game. She got me into it very early, and so I was a pretty competitive player. And as a result of that, I ended up playing in going through kind of the American youth soccer pipeline, and getting to a pretty high level, and thinking that I had, like, kind of achieved a lot. And then once you leave that pipeline, kind of realizing all the other things on the outside of it. So,
Hmm.
I was very much like, when I would play in my club games, I was the first kid. I remember this so vividly, around like 12 years old. I was the first kid to dive, you know, to 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 get a call. And I was, just like anybody who's doing something for the first time, I was not very subtle about it, right? Like, I'd seen it so much on television, probably watching a lot of Liga MX, because that's what I was watching. And I knew that in certain instances that was the best thing to do, and that the best guys were doing that. So I remember very vividly, it was like a U12 travel game. I was playing for the Herndon Internationals in Northern Virginia, and some kid I knew was coming. I nudged the ball away. I let him. I kind of drew the contact, and my knee, almost like Nancy Kerrigan. Very obvious, like, oh my God, this kid's dead. And then I pop up 2 seconds later, and I was ready to go. And eventually, but I did wear my socks like Marco Echeverri. Like I did little things that were kind of evident that I was Latino, but I was the only kid that was doing that. And remember, I'm half. I'm also
Yeah.
half white, and my parents, through their hard work, had the resources to put me in those situations. But when I left that bubble, then I saw, oh no, like I'm not the best Latino kid. That I was the only Latino kid on the best team in
Right.
Virginia. It's just that those kids didn't have access to this world. And I think that was a very I think in a moment you realize, oh wow, it's humbling, and I'm not that good, but it's also like, wow, there's so much more to this soccer world than what I was exposed to. And that is, I think, also very exciting.
Well, that the thing you were exposed to a type of soccer on television that the kids you were playing with later probably never watched,
Totally.
right? But then you're also playing in an environment that, as you said, lots of kids across the country, Latino or otherwise, don't have access to, and I think that's kind of become kind of central to your outlook on American soccer at this point, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think generally, like growing up in the United States, if you have an immigrant parent or two immigrant parents, you just have a kind of different perspective usually on the United States. Not all the time that those perspectives are the same, but I think having a parent that immigrates, and from in my instance, like my mom, very late in life, she came in her late 20s, so not very early on. You just have a different kind of perspective on things, and for sure, in my coverage of the U.S., I think I don't have that kind of innate fandom, which is not necessarily like a good or a bad thing. I think there's space for that in coverage. I think
Mm-hmm.
if we're being like I would step away from the idea of we don't need either a fan's perspective or people who are excitable like fans, leading the discussion. I think that's a huge part of it, and I think we're seeing that across sports media. But I do think there's a little bit of a colder approach of somebody who, at least kind of coming up, didn't maybe idolize the US program, didn't idolize the American players. And in large part, like for me as a Mexico fan, the US were the rivals. And it wasn't until literally a kid on my club team got called up to the US under 17 World Cup team that I was like, okay, like I got to start, like, I'm not going to root against Irwin, like I got to start rooting for these teams, and kind of it changed there for me a little bit. But yeah, I think maybe people would see that in my coverage, but that's also a reflection of the coverage you would get in a place like Mexico, which is also what I've been watching for the last 10 or 15 years. Is I watch ESPN Deportes day in and day out, and that coverage,
Mm-hmm.
even though those folks grew up as fans of the game, is still very harsh. And I think that's
Sure.
probably more what influences my coverage style. Less so much, not being a US fan as a kid, and more just seeing what I see as kind of the ultimate success story, which is a show like Futbol Picante down in Mexico, which is
Mm-hmm.
the driver of discussion in Mexican soccer, and a powerhouse. And that to me is like the way they do it is very aggressive, and that's what I see as both entertaining, but also, Jason, lacking in the U.S. market.
Yeah, that flair for drama prevails not just in game
Polemica.
calls. It prevails on television with the analysis as well. I
Yep.
mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think, not to make this about me, this is about you, but the way I come at what I do is, I grew up on sports talk radio in America,
Yep.
and even though you got homers on the radio, they're the first one to call for the coach to be fired, and
Yep.
it's like, okay, yeah, that's the entertainment value. And I guess, we're talking about your origins and, following Mexico and going to the 94 World Cup and playing and all those things. But I'm curious, if we kind of fast forward to where you are now, how much, without giving away all the secrets, how much, as you mentioned, you're a contrarian, maybe naturally, is not an act, Sebi, but you know what I'm
Mm.
saying. There's a level of extra that you put on when you go on air, right?
I think, yeah. So I think it's different than. Listen, my start in broadcasting was always in a newsroom setting, kind of in like local news, and I was always the sports guy. So in
Can I can I
general,
can I
yeah,
pause for a second, since
come
you
on,
did send
yeah.
me three pictures and I want to use them all?
Oh
Tell
yeah.
let's talk about this. What's happening here?
This
What's
is
happening here?
from so this is the very beginnings of the broadcasting career. This is at Westminster College, where I went in Western Pennsylvania. And I literally went there because the assistant soccer coach called me. They'd won a bunch of games the year before I went there, and they had a radio station and TV station that was pretty much unmanned, but running 24/7. And
Right.
the guy in charge of it, shout out Dr. B, Dr. David Barner, said you can work the second you get on campus, and that's exactly what I did. And here I'm. Clearly, you can see the era. It's early 2000s. I've got the way too baggy clothes.
Those are cargo pants,
Those are
Sebby.
cargo
Those are
pants.
cargo
Those are
pants.
cargo pants, and I wonder what's going on with that top. It's definitely not mine. It's
Yeah.
definitely borrowed. But that was the beginnings. I always kind of knew that that I wanted to do this, not necessarily Football Americas or debate soccer on
Sure.
TV. But I always knew as soon as I kind of realized, like, hey, man, you're not going to play for DC United. You're not going to be a professional soccer player. I wanted to be then in sports broadcasting. That was like the next focus. And I think through that process, eventually I came to have the opportunity at ESPN to develop kind of this personality, which is, okay, I'm no longer the reporter. I'm no longer the sideline reporter or the anchor. Now I'm the host of a debate show, and it is my job to debate. Now, it's not
Right.
always my job to just scream and be a contrarian. It's also my job to deliver the news, because we do what you do on your show, which is news, opinion. It's a hybrid. So you know how it is. You walk a tightrope.
Yeah.
There's moments where you're kind of saying, hey, this is the news of what occurred, and now I'm shifting into my opinion or my reaction to Herc's opinion, or in your case, your reaction to any guest's opinion.
Yeah.
And that's a tough balance to strike. And I think that's something that, when people are like, oh, are you putting on? So no, I'm striking a balance that I'm new at, or that is a relatively new role.
I also think that, and again, if we're going to get into the to the approach of it, sometimes it's not that you are putting on, but you may find yourself in the moment going in a direction you didn't even know you were going to go in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if that happens to you. It happens to me sometimes. It's like, oh, I didn't know this was my opinion until just now.
Yeah.
I didn't figure out my thoughts on this until just now, especially if you are kind of responding to a news item in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what makes the best TV, right? Is you can go in and say, this is my idea of what I want to discuss. But the other guy throws a right hook, and suddenly, like, you have to react to that. And maybe the conversation goes in a way that's not exactly planned. I think people can look at a show like Football Americas and say, oh, it's premeditated. What's premeditated is the planning part of it. It's, hey, what are we going to talk about? Like, people don't realize we do an hour show. We do a freaking 90-minute production meeting, which is a lot of that argument boiled down to, all right, how do we get this down into 2 or 3 minutes? So, we're not picking things to debate that we're not passionate about or don't actually disagree on. We're bringing you the best of our already debate in the production meeting, and trying to bring that to you in a concise way that fits our television restrictions, which aren't as strict as linear. We have a pretty wide open lane, but we still have a lot of ground to cover. And that people are like, oh, you just do a North American soccer show. There's a million things in North American soccer. I always tell them, like, oh, you don't think we could fill? Ask Jason Davis about filling. Yeah.
I want to go back to little Sebi and again, Mexico fan, 94 World Cup. I don't know. How old were you when in 94?
So I was coming out of 5th grade, so 10
Okay,
years
so
old.
you're 10.
10 years old right there. Yeah.
Prime sports fan territory. It's when you're at your most intense. 2 years later, Major League Soccer hits DC with DC United, and they're good, Sebi. You got that too. Tell me about how you responded to those teams in the 90s.
No, I mean, that was just so special. I had always admired the Mexican national team and Club America from afar, but the second that, and I think the poster's still in my parents' basement, that they dropped the John Harkes poster, with him juggling a ball and the DC United kit, it was an obsession. And just like with the World Cup tickets, my dad kind of, saw ahead and said, "Wait, we're going to get season tickets for that first year." And going to the games, going to the 97 MLS Cup in the rain at RFK was just amazing. And I think having not just a team that was winning, because that definitely was fun. But having that atmosphere in your backyard, and then having those players, like very
Mm-hmm.
specifically Marco Echeverri, Raul Diaz Arce, that lit up the community, Jaime Moreno, those guys, and then the American stars that came through, the Tony Santas, the Eddie Popes, the John Harks, all that really made for a special blend, and something that I could sink my teeth into from like every angle. So I was
Mm-hmm.
all in on DC United in the early days at RFK, and that pretty quickly for me became favorite team, right? Like it was like I liked a team in each of the major sports, and then I liked my Club America and my Mexican national team the most. And then once DC United was in your backyard, it was like, wow, I can not just see this team every week, but watch content about them all the time. And that was really the beginning of what was a pretty intense love affair for a really long time.
The early years of DC United, and I'll admit I was in the area but not paying attention with various things. And then culturally, it was not, soccer had been part of my life, but it had not made the impact on me at that point that it obviously had made on you. And I think having your mom be your guide is a major part of that. But the character of DC, I mean, I don't know you at the time as a 12-year-old, as a 14-year-old, you're not thinking about it in this way. But when you look back to the way it sort of started, and I think it's easy for modern MLS fans to go, oh, whatever, that was MLS 1.0. It was ugly. They didn't play good soccer. They're playing in football stadiums. What was it? What was the culture? I think DC had a culture that maybe people don't appreciate.
Yeah, and I think so much of that comes down to the atmosphere of RFK. And I think the atmosphere of RFK was built around kind of a unique understanding of the soccer fan. And a lot of that credit goes to Kevin Payne. He knew, one, that the supporters group atmosphere would be well received, right? Would be an advertisement for games. And he also, I think, knew that there was a way to attract the Latino fan directly. And he did that with great players in very key positions, right? Like if you've
Mm.
ever watched Liga MX, if you've ever watched the Argentine League, you ever watch any Latin American league, we're obsessed with tens, So you drop a great baller Latino 10 into that team. For those that don't know, there's a massive Bolivian American population in and around DC. And then you put a guy like Raul Diaz Arce, and you have so many Salvadorans in the Washington,
Mm.
D.C. area. And you had something that was very, I think, representative of the actual soccer community of DC. And I think that's something that since and in other markets, MLS has maybe struggled to recapture. That was
Yeah.
truly early days of DC United. You would go to RFK, and if you were a soccer player, a ref, a league administrator, you were going to run into the people that you were dealing with in those facets at the stadium. And that was, I think, the beautiful thing. It wasn't its own thing. It was kind of the celebration of a bubbling soccer community that was already there and just needed that kind of capstone project.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, you're right. Kevin Payne did, and the early days. I mean, we know
Mm.
the story that they were called DC United, which was not necessarily a nod to the Latino community, but was certainly a nod to soccer. While these other teams are being called the Clash and the
Right.
Burn and all that stuff. In terms of your pathway to being a broadcaster and sort of the things that you have learned along the way. What stands out? I mean, I was just thinking about your Bob Bradley moment a little while ago for no
Get
reason.
lost.
Talk to
Get
Sebastian
lost.
Salazar.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about this. I mean, now that you're on a debate show, that's more of an opening up of the personality of Sebastian Salazar.
Yeah,
When you're asking a coach 3 questions at halftime, it's a different kind of thing.
totally.
How much did you think about your approach and whether you should be more aggressive or how many platitudes can you look for, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think at the end of the day, when you get just the question about the pathway, I think I'm lucky enough that I kind of worked through the television industry as it shifted. So I went from when I started my first full-time job in sports, I was shooting high school sports and putting that into a local broadcast and cutting on VHS tapes. And, then I got to a regional sports network and I was working on the website. So I kind of really got to understand beyond just like TV content. And the reality of content online is that you have to be good. Like you have to back it up with numbers. On television, you can hide a little bit, right? There are ways to hide behind numbers, and there are moments in which numbers don't matter as much. But when you're online, your numbers are really what dictates whether you're successful or not. So when you've approached content online and kind of left the television bubble, when you come back to TV, you realize that that's still the game. Your content still has to generate interest, whether that's on ESPN Plus or on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is. So I think that's really when I think about my pathway and how it kind of informed, you know, my approach. It's that it's just knowing that you can either fill time or you can make content that generates discussion, and one of those is going to keep you around much longer than the other.
Okay, forget the Bob Bradley stuff. We'll put that aside because
Oh
now
yes,
I'm
Bob
curious.
Bradley. Bob Bradley.
Well,
Yeah.
no, I'll come back to that because I was trying to talk my way through a question that I couldn't quite remember. So I'm glad we're not live, is what I'm saying, Sevi. The Football Americas. I mean, if we're going to come to that, and we're going to come to the not just the approach, but sort of I mentioned this when I talked to Herc not that long ago, that you were out there on Twitter. You were bragging a bit. You were saying, "Hey, look at what we're doing over on Football Americas. This is clearly your baby." Tell me about the process and getting to this point and how you even created or how you were even came to put this show on the air, internet or otherwise.
If you think the show is aggressive, you should have seen the process to bring it to life. I mean, really, it's just something that I always felt there was a need for once I got to ESPN. I saw other attempts to kind of do something in this space, and it's really hard. Like it's really hard at ESPN to, I think, get the weight of ESPN behind a soccer project. When you do, you have success. It's just kind of automatic because of the size of the platform. But it's not always a guarantee that you can get the platform turned that way. So, for me, when I started thinking about Football Americas and what we could do at ESPN, I just saw a need in the market and a need at the network. And so at that point, it was like, well, I know that Herc and I have worked together on a million things. I know we have good chemistry. And I know that when ESPN FC ever has to do content in this space, they're calling us up to one of us join the show and talk about it. So why don't we just make that content kind of on our own for YouTube, for ESPN, and see how it does? And that led to kind of a tracking of those numbers. And then the tracking of those numbers led to the organization of those numbers. That led to like kind of a pitch and an idea and a plan to expand. And then it was just, and again, this is the benefit and the difficulty of a place like ESPN. It's like you have a key and you know that at some point you're going to put it in a door and it's going to open the door and big things are going to happen. But there's so many freaking doors. And so it took us a while. It took, Herc a while, me a while. My wife, for those that don't know, my wife also works at ESPN. She works on kind of the social media side. And, she had her antennas up and was kind of like listening to what was happening in the company. And it took us all a while before we finally got it in front of the right people. But once we did, it was pretty clear that this was the thing that the company was also looking for in some other regards. And so once that happened, it was a very quick commitment to, all right, we're going to do it twice a week. Here's your place on ESPN Plus. Here's your budget. And from there, we felt like we were well supported enough to do something. Because really at the ESPN level, if you're going to scratch and claw and kind of do it on your own, like we were doing on YouTube, it's not sustainable. You need the support of the network. And once we got that support, which was early 2021 when we launched the show, I think that's really when we were like, okay, like this idea, this project is now for real. And we got to make it special. And then again, I think that's what comes back to, our quest to be a little, not our quest, our just general, edge when it comes to being a little bit more aggressive in our analysis and opinions.
Well, you're bridging worlds, right? I mean, these worlds exist side by side. Sometimes they connect in other places, but it's pretty clear that intrinsic to the success of Football Americas is the fact that you are are approaching the whole continent, certainly Mexican football soccer in America at the same time in a way that speaks. And I've talked to Herc about this. I think you and I have talked about this as well, in a way that speaks to a lot of people in this country who don't feel like they either have to go over here for this specific thing or over here for this other specific thing, and those two things don't come together.
Yeah, and it's an experiment, Jason. Like, and I know you know this from your program. How wide can you spread the net? And I think, without making a product then that's so watered down that nobody enjoys it, right? And so, how much do U.S. fans care about what's happening with Mexico? How much do MLS fans care about what's happening with Liga MX? How much do men's soccer fans care about women's soccer fans, and vice versa? And so I think we're always kind of trying to walk that line of balancing all that within. But also, I think we're very well positioned and lucky. Like, Herc played in MLS and Liga MX. He's Mexican American. I'm Mexican American. I grew up watching Liga MX. I grew up going to MLS games almost every week. So as those leagues are coming together, as the USA-Mexico rivalry continues to grow, and I think be even more prominent on like the global stage, and certainly in this region, like, who else is better positioned in that regard to talk about it from both sides than specifically like somebody like Herc? I mean that player is so rare, is so unique that I think when you talk about him, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so keen on working with him and kind of exploiting, for lack of a better term, our chemistry. Because if you look at where soccer's heading, the biggest example being the World Cup 2026 and now maybe 27, the Women's World Cup, it's United States and Mexico coming together. So, a Mexican-American perspective then becomes very critical, and even more so in English, because English is becoming the dominant language of the Mexican-American community, especially on the younger end, which is the key demographic that all these companies claim to want.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting, because you're giving content to a community that may feel cut off from the origin, or at least the older generations, and how they interact with that. How does that impact, you talked about taking your cues as a broadcaster and in a debate format from your experiences watching Futbol Picante and Mexican football coverage. How does it inform you? And you already talked about doing goal calls when you're calling games, but how does it inform the approach more generally to the idea of, okay, yes, we're doing some Mexican content. Obviously, we're speaking to a lot of Latino Americans. How Mexican in flavor do we want this to be?
Yeah. So I think one, it's important to point out that it's not just that fiery style, that aggressive style is not unique just to Mexico or even Latin America. Like, if you obviously, we could point out the English press have been accused of being incredibly aggressive and critical against their own team. So that's something that's global. I think when I watch Futbol Picante, what I get as a fan, as a consumer, is I get drawn into a dramatic product, right? If they criticize a coach, that's good TV. If they criticize a coach and then that coach calls in live and confronts them, that's amazing television. And that there are, interactions and sparrings like that on a nightly basis on shows like Futbol Picante. I'm talking about, if you care about Mexican soccer, must watch TV. People will be like, on your phone, turn on Futbol Picante right now. It's going down. That to me is what I want for Futbol Americas one day. We've had moments of that when we get Greg Berhalter in studio and Herc is kind of confronting him about being soft, the team being soft under him. That's a moment that I think, I have always envisioned from watching Futbol Picante. So I think we're kind of always chasing, not necessarily drama for drama's sake, but confrontation of ideas. Confrontation of ideas. We want that because I think it makes for good, compelling television, no matter the sport you cover. And then on top of that, if you look at the soccer content, I think in this country, again, it just largely lacks that. So I think we're not just doing it because it's a good flavor. We're also doing it because I think it's like a new flavor to the market, and
How
and
much?
and
How
that's why I
much?
think we've had success
And
for
this is less
whatever
about
reason.
you or Herc, but how much do the production elements inform some? I was just thinking as you were
Yeah,
talking about El Chiringuito in Spain and how
totally,
it's
totally.
become this phenomenon. How do you guys approach those things?
So I have a little bit, I'll always say, a producer's mind, because when I used to do like the local sports newscast, you're one man band, you're producing. So I always thought that Football Americas would be kind of my vision executed on television. But if you've ever watched a show, you hear me talk all the time about producer Beto, and he's a television producer. So he kind of has the ideas that really make the show pop. There was one time where we got Vela and Chicharito to cross on a stream at the same time. Surprised, the two of them. They didn't know it was going to happen, and that's a great moment. We get Shaqiri and Chicharito on at the same time ahead of a Chicago Galaxy game, and we're comparing goals. And like I think we have really, with Futbol Americas, said that we can do a debate show, we can do a podcast for sure, and we'll do some of that. But we also have an ESPN production team here that can cut highlights, right? That can come up with fancy graphics, that can do all the cool stuff that maybe soccer hasn't gotten in this country before. So let's turn that, not just the shiny graphics and that part of it, but the
Mhm.
expertise of these like really high-end television production people towards this content. And that's where you get segments like Get Lost, which is naturally a segment of confrontation and is obviously built off the interaction with Bob Bradley. And so anytime we do a Get Lost, it's going to be one of us hauling off on somebody, right? That's just that it's got to be. And so if that segment didn't exist, then we don't have that dynamic. But that is when you talk about kind of the production elements on television. We're really lucky that we have me and Herc and whatever we bring to the table. But we have this incredible production team out in Los Angeles, led by producer Beto, and what they do to take our ideas and then make it like ESPN television worthy
Mhm.
is just next level.
So you've got a show at Football Americas that is, making waves. It's obviously got an audience, and I deal with this occasionally, where somebody will say, "Oh, Jason, I listen all the time," or "You do a great job." Usually, it's complimentary. Thank you to the people who are nice to me. But I said this to somebody recently, like, "Oh, don't tell me you listen, because I don't need to remember that people are hearing what I'm saying because I don't want to censor myself." Do you
Right.
have? I mean, you're talking about being a kid in DC and
Mm-hmm.
and idolizing these players. Not all of them are still around to have to deal with, but let's imagine there's a player you loved as a kid, and now he's a manager, now he's an administrator, and you've got to be critical. How do
Yeah.
you kind of process that?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny. I mean, the best example for me is Ben Olsen, right? Like a guy who I grew up really, truly idolizing. I loved Ben Olsen as a kid growing up in DC. He became the coach. I covered him. It was very difficult for me to criticize Ben. Eventually we were neighbors. We kind of lived downtown. And at that point, it was really tough for me, to criticize. But I would be honest about that. I'd say, hey, man, it's tough for me. Also, it was tough for me because I kind of knew some of the inner workings of DC United and knew maybe some of the limitations there. But Ben was complaining about the referees last week. He was one of, I don't know, 5 or 6 MLS coaches that were crying in their cereal about it. And I called him out on the show. Now, I think the reality is, and I learned this when I got to ESPN because, well, I think there was an interaction. There was an interaction with a DC United player in 2015 when we were still the regional sports network of DC United at CSN Washington, where something that had been said on a show that I produced and was running really pissed somebody off. And that was the first time I had to kind of really deal with it, kind of face to face. There are a few incidents in Houston, but nothing major. And when I got to ESPN, I remember, going to ESPN FC and hosting the show for the first time and getting with, guys like Craig Burley and Steve Nickel. And, Craig told me, like, one of the things that sticks to me in this day is like, hey, man, I don't have any, too many friends left in the business. I don't have like a lot of, there's the guys that I played with, but they're kind of irrelevant now. And like at Chelsea, they don't love me. And, I don't really care because I hammer Chelsea. And it was something that stuck out to me. And Steve Nichols said the same thing. He's like, you either kind of keep your friends or you're a good broadcaster.
Mm.
And I think you got to make that choice. at some point, especially for former players. There's a
Yeah.
lot of guys that are former players who are doing the job, and they'll come on and they'll fill the time and they'll kind of give their opinions. And I think just, again, not just because I work with him, but I think it's one of the reasons why Herc sets himself apart, because he's not worried about keeping his friends. Maybe he'll tell you that there's some guys he doesn't go after, but he's not shy about saying something that is gonna ruffle some feathers. And with an absence of that around him, he stands out very specifically because of it.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to have to process that, maybe one day you're going to run into somebody that you've said something negative about, and then how are you going to handle yourself?
Yeah.
And,
But you got to, but I think the point there is
defend your place, defend
right.
your position.
And you can't say, like, you can't be at some point saying things that you can't defend into somebody's face. And I think that's something that I always think about and is ever present. Like, if somebody were to come to me and be upset and say whatever, and they have been, can I defend myself? Not can I make them agree with me, but can I defend
Right.
my position honestly and feel good about it? And for me, that's always the case.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to, while you may amplify certain parts of an argument, or you may go a little bit more aggressive with tone and approach,
Of course.
generally speaking, you have to say things you believe in, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself in big trouble. If you and look, if you do want to go out into the world, if you don't, if you want to just hide in a cave somewhere,
Yeah.
I think plenty of broadcasters kind of have done that, and not just in soccer, but in sports in general.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think it depends on your role, right? And what's happening now is, as the industry shrinks, people are being forced to be more versatile. So there's people that are more like me, who are not, you can't say, oh, Sebi's a play-by-play guy. Not really. Do I do play-by-play? Yes, but am I a play-by-play guy? No. Oh, Sebi's a host. Oh, really? But like, he also does reporting and play. Oh, he's a reporter. You have to do all of it. And when
Yeah.
you end up doing all of it, you do things that put you in conflict, right? You're going to be one day analyzing in studio, and you're going to be one day then reporting in the locker room, facing the person, face to face. And you have to get comfortable with doing all that. And I think when you're asked to do all that, a lot of people choose to then, in those other roles, kind of scale back maybe their criticism. And I get it. I'm not saying that the way we do it or I do it is correct, because not everybody's me, and nor should they be. You can get great content doing it like a bunch of different ways. It doesn't have to be interacting. It doesn't have to be Bob Bradley telling you to get lost. Is that great content? Yes. But Bob Bradley putting his arm around me and saying, man, I really love you, and that would have also been great
Yeah,
content.
absolutely.
So,
yeah, it's an interesting point you make, that people are being forced to do different things, and sometimes that means moving away from straight reporting and into being more of a personality,
Yep.
which gets you more attention, potentially gets you more money, potentially gets you more jobs, gets you more attention. So I ask you about the other side of this. Anybody who does a public facing job, particularly in broadcasting, gets hate, Sebi. How do you handle hate?
How do I handle hate? So, I mean, I think 99% of hate is kind of anonymous and online. And I think there's pretty easy ways to filter that. I think it took me a while, because at first, and I don't know, when this happened for you. You've been in this specific lane a lot longer than I have. But there comes a point, and it was for me, not right when I got to ESPN, a while at ESPN, where I started to get a lot of engagement and a lot of reaction on social media. And at some point, you're like, oh, this is new and this is interesting, and this means I've arrived and I'm going to engage with all this. And then at some point, you realize, oh, as long as it's there and the engagement is there, it doesn't really matter what's being said. And I think once I figured that out, it allowed me to really look at the hate as just, honestly, thank you. Like, that extra comment is like another dart to the algorithm. And if you hate me, great.
Right.
That's not a problem for me. As long as you don't track me down at home and
Well,
and scream at
so
me, that's fine.
you brought that up. Okay, so yes, if someone's anonymous and says, "Oh, I just don't
Yeah,
like Sebastian
yeah,
Salazar. He's terrible. Get him off the air,"
yeah.
and we've all dealt with that. I think that's easy to sort of process away.
Right.
But to give an example, there is somebody who lives in my general area who has tweeted some extremely angry things at me and has pointed out that he lives in my general area. Not a direct
Right.
threat, Sebi, but enough
Right.
to make me go, "Oh shit, I don't
Right.
like
Yeah.
this. This doesn't make me feel good."
Yeah, no, I mean, there are definite times when I think, just to touch on something that we were discussing earlier, around identity.
Hmm.
I will get some pretty, racially charged things in my DMs
Hmm.
about what I am and what people think I am and what people think I'm not. Um,
It's
and
funny how they get to decide those things for you.
Totally. And there was a time in my life, where I probably did have more identity issues because I was like trying to figure out what I was
Yeah.
instead of just realizing, dude, you're not anything. You just are this kind of one off, and
Well,
that's
you
fine.
can be both. You can be all
Yes.
things if you want to
Yes.
be.
Yeah. And I think that's like once you figure that out, then all the other stuff on the outside, the hate, as we say, just becomes less relevant. But it took a while to go from, oh wow, I'm loving all this engagement, to, okay, there's a negative side to all of this engagement,
Yeah.
but it's still valuable to me. I just need to filter it, block it out. And then, when there are those interactions, or, whatever it might be, where somebody crosses the line or somebody comes up to you and, in person, I think, at that point, you just kind of have to believe in what you've said again and just, you know, keep it moving. I don't think I've ever had an experience with somebody in person that was worse than what they've said online. Usually it's the opposite, right? Somebody online will say, you're the worst, you're the worst. And then in
In
real life, they
person.
come up and
Yeah.
they're like, hey, I watch your show every week. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
that's all I need, buddy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So that's interesting, and maybe just in terms of the fame level, and I think you're way more famous than me. So this is
Ha.
well, you're on
I'm known
television,
as I'm known as
Semi.
I'm known as Herc's camera guy everywhere we go because everyone wants a picture with
Well,
Herc, and I'm the
that
official
was okay.
photographer.
Obviously, Hercules Gomez played in the World
Yes.
Cup. We don't need
Right, right.
to glow him up anymore. But that part of it, like, how do you handle it? I mean, not all of us. Some of us do this job and we're socially awkward. How do you handle people coming up to you and being effusive with their praise?
I've always worked in places where I felt really like honored if people were watching. If it's local news and somebody comes up to you at the gas station or at the supermarket and says, "Hey, I'm watching you." Like, that was early in my career, and that was really flattering. That was like, "Oh wow, okay, like, great, we're doing a good job." And when I would run into people that would, then say the same thing about, the work at DC United, is kind of when I first started to hear from people in my community about it. And when I see, and it's funny because, I live in Northwest DC. I live in a place that's very, like, there's a soccer bar right up the block, like
Hmm.
a very soccer neighborhood. I mean, I've literally had it where my wife and I have been walking the kid and somebody be like, dude from Football Americas. They don't know my name, but they're like, dude from Football Americas or ESPN FC. I'm not on that level yet. They know the show I'm on, not
That's
necessarily the name. The guy with Herculez Gomez. But what I would say with Football Americas, especially, is anytime somebody comes up to me about Football Americas, it's like deeply, deeply meaningful. Just knowing what I think about that show, what we went through to do it, how much we enjoy doing it. And when I have, somebody, especially like, we get this a lot, like young Latino kids will come up and be like, man, I love the show, this and that, whatever. There's this one comment that just stands out to me after the World Cup. There was a young woman, I think she was probably like early 20s, mid 20s, and she was like, this show helped me connect better with my dad.
oh,
And I
that's
was like,
awesome.
because she maybe didn't have the Spanish to maybe listen to Univision and really connect, but maybe he had
Hmm.
enough English to, and then this. So I think there are times when you get comments like that where it's really lifting, but just generally, I'm desperate to make Football America stick around. I'm desperate for it to work at ESPN. So when people come up and say something about the work, um, to me, it's like, it's just the best feeling in the world. Like, I don't think I'll
Yeah.
ever get to a place where that's tiresome. I just had a kid, so like maybe there'll be a point where my kid's screaming and I'll be like, I don't have time for a picture. But even then, I it's so it's I think of it as such an honor when people consume your content, especially when it's content that you really are pouring your soul into, and about that. I'm sure you probably have some similar feelings.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I am always appreciative of people who like what I do, 100%. Because you're never. I mean, you
Or
probably
consume
have.
it. You don't have to like me,
Sure,
but yeah,
that's a
yeah,
good point. You don't have to
yeah,
like me. Just keep me able to
yeah,
do this thing that
totally.
I don't know how to do anything else, Sebi. That's the
Yeah,
problem.
exactly,
Um,
exactly.
you talked about your kid. We won't have a ton of time to kind of dive into this, but I'm curious how fatherhood fits you and fits your lifestyle and the job and that thing that happens where you start to feel the push and pull of I want to make things. This has always been what I do. Oh, but I also don't want to miss my kid. I don't want
Yeah.
to. I don't want to miss out on her growing up.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's a shock to the system. He was born mid-February, and so he's just over 2 months. Right now, and he's a handful.
So
He's
you're
like
not
great.
sleeping, is what
No,
you're
no,
telling me.
no, not at all, not at all. For nothing, man. And he's a loud kid, which people who know me and know that I'm a talker. If you've met my wife, she can talk too. So no surprise that this kid's got a loud personality and he's keeping us up. But it's great. I think what's been like the biggest challenge for me is that you so I've been obsessed with this career with broadcasting and then eventually getting to ESPN and then a soccer show and being obsessed with something is not new to me. Being obsessed with two things is kind of new to me. And so that's what really the last few months has been. It's like, okay, how do I'm going to be obsessed with this kid. There's no other way, that's just the reality. But I'm not any less obsessed with this work thing. And there's not any less urgency around it either. Cause now, you got mouths to feed, as they
Yeah.
say. So
Yeah.
it's like work is somehow less important, but more important. And it's also this release from this other kind of incredibly intense experience. But man, being a father is something like I think I've always been a coach. I've always kind of like dabbled in that lane. I've always been around kids. I've always worked with kids. I've been the funkle for a long time, and so we're already working on our soccer skills. Like I've been looking
Oh,
forward to this for a minute. So
wow.
it's
Okay.
been
Two
great for sure.
months. 2 months old.
Oh
Already working
yeah.
on the soccer
Oh yeah. I
skills.
juggle in front of him every morning. We're gonna monkey see,
Wow.
monkey do.
I'm so mine is 2 years old. I'm you in the future. There are balls in every room of the house. I'm following
Beautiful. Yep.
that
Yep.
Tom Son model.
Yep. Yep.
So you got
Soccer
got to
starts
do
at
that
home.
as soon as they're able to run around. You got to do
Yep.
that. I do have a question about being a father and obviously being who you are. You said unique person, Mexican American, not Mexican, whatever it is you think of yourself.
Mhm.
I'm not putting any labels on you.
Yeah.
How have you thought about what that means for your kid and sort of
Yeah.
how you want to get him culturally adapted?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because it was even an issue when it came down to the name. So, people who know me will know that my legal name is not Sebastian Salazar. It's Sebastian Driver Salazar. Driver is my
Mm-hmm.
father's name.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who knew me in high school, like college, that's who I was. It wasn't until I got to my first job in the industry and actually the Chiron, the graphics machine at this very small station didn't have enough space for Driver Salazar. So it's so funny, it's so flippant, but it's so important. The GM of that station was like, "Hey, he's an old Southern white guy." He said, "Not for nothing, man. I think Salazar will get you a long way. I think it would be a good play." I said, "Sure, dude. Whatever. At the next stop, I'll change it back." No, but once you put it on tape, you're kind of pot committed to it at that point. So,
Yeah.
so it became my identity, and so then now when I'm born with this kid, it's like, all right, we got his mother's name, my two last names, the name that
Mm-hmm.
I'm known as, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you don't want people to not know he's your kid, but maybe you also don't want him to know he's, your kid. I don't know. Maybe Stephen A. Smith gives his kid some other name or whatever. So a lot of questions. So we didn't decide. We threw all the three last names on there. We made her
Wow.
name. Her name is the middle name, and then we gave them both of my
Wait,
last
hold on. Her
names.
name is the legal middle name.
Her name is the legal middle name,
Okay.
and then my
Okay.
two last names he's stuck
Okay.
with.
So
And
my
so
kid.
as far as identity, I think we'll we'll do our best to let him choose.
Okay.
Is where I'm going.
Okay.
But he
All right.
will speak Spanish. That's something we've really like clearly decided. I'm speaking to him in Spanish. My mom is very involved as well, so she's speaking in Spanish, and
Okay.
mom and the other grandma speak in English, and
Okay.
that's
We
kind of how
should
we'll go.
compare notes because there's so many
Yes,
parallels here. Now, we ended up. I only have one last name, but it's in the Latin naming convention. My kid has two last names,
right.
my name and then his mother's
Yep,
last name, which
yep.
is her father's last name, but she also has her mother's last. You know how this it gets interesting squeezing this all together. Since you mentioned coaching, I don't want to leave this. I don't want to end this without sharing this last picture you sent, which I just want people. I
Yeah.
mean, this is obviously going to be an audio product in addition to a video product. I hope people are navigating to the video so they can see this. If you look at this picture, there's some. This looks interesting. You're immediately like, wait a second, what's happening here?
Right.
I see Sebastian Salazar over there, and then I see a bunch of women who are definitely not, young. No offense to
Yep.
them, young women. What's going on here?
So this is in the late '90s. I'm probably a freshman in high school, or yeah, freshman in high school there, maybe sophomore. And this is my mom's over 30 soccer team. So my mom launched a team in the '94 World after the '94 World Cup. She was kind of inspired by it, and she started a team in the local rec department. And the team lasted for 20 years. The Samba, legendary crew. I had dozens of aunts on this team, women who I still, will see to this day, have great memories. And so, they were pretty serious. And at some point they had coaches. And at one point, one coach kind of left in the middle of the season and I took over and I coached them for a few years. And it was really the first time that I thought about soccer beyond the player, right? Beyond kind
Mm-hmm.
of myself and my role in the playing aspect. And so that was really, a critical experience for me. And coaching is something like that I've never really been able to shake. In all of my stops of my career, I've found ways to coach, to be involved. And if ever the TV thing was to dry up, I would definitely like do something in that space because it really is an amazing way to give back, an amazing way to like stay involved in the game. And for me, like this experience with this group of women specifically was really the first time that I thought of soccer, from anything more than surface level. And
Yeah,
that was really an eye-opening experience. And they were
that's.
badasses, man. We hung some banners too. Samba, what a
You
crew.
you had some trophies or
Yep.
the equivalent for rec soccer going
Oh
the
no, they
case.
had
That's
they would give out these like almost comically huge trophies. Montgomery County Rec Soccer. They're still in my parents' basement. They're like as tall as I am. It's just absurd.
it's amazing. All right, I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure we shared all the pictures, all the
Yep.
photos that Sevi sent along. Sebastian Salazar, thank you so much. This was great.
Of course, man. Great to be with you as always, Jason.